All right, chapter 37. We're going to be going over the Eisenhower era here briefly. This video should not take very long, and we're going to get through this information so that you have some of the basics and especially the test questions you're going to want to have access to. So in chapter 37, we're going to be going over a whole lot of things that are cultural history, and these are actually kind of some of the fun things about what life was like for individuals who were living through that era and things like that. The very first thing we run into here is this black box here that says, during the 1952 campaign, Eisenhower declared that he would what to help end the Korean War. The answer to that is that he declared he would personally go to Korea and bring an end to the war. And this ends up being kind of a funny thing about the way he went about doing this. He really already had the election in 1952 tied up. The election was kind of unique and interesting in a lot of different ways. He is essentially the one man that everybody in the country agreed need to be running the country. Both Republicans and Democrats were begging him to run as a Republican or a Democrat, whichever the case may be. He really already had the election tied up. The only hiccups in his entire campaign actually had to do with his vice presidential running mate, a man by the name of Richard Nixon, who you've probably heard of. And we're going to see what happened there as well. So let's get into some of the cultural history real quick before we get too deep into this. So we're going to see a whole bunch of these texts from the quotes from the textbook, and they'll kind of give you some cool clues as to what's happening that'll form the basis of our conversation. It says a quiet revolution was marked in 1956 when white-collar workers for the first time outnumbered blue-collar workers, signaling the passage from an industrial to a post-industrial era. Union membership as a percentage of the labor force peaked at about 35% in 1954 and then went into a steady decline. Okay, so what's happening? White collar workers. If you look here on the picture on the right, when we say white collar, we're talking about guys who wear business suits. And if you look at blue collar workers, you see the picture on the left, we're talking about guys who pretty much work with their hands for a living. Okay, and we're seeing here that our economy is changing dramatically, and we're seeing white collar workers outnumber blue collar workers really for the first time. Okay, and this also, as you see the quote says, union membership is going to end up decreasing quite dramatically over that time period as well. Okay, now what else? Well, we also have, if you see the picture here, this is a family that everyone in the country in the 1950s was very well accustomed to seeing. This is Leave It to Beaver. You see the little boy here in the bottom right, that's Beaver Cleaver. And this is Ward and June Cleaver. And we see that this family here, that they are essentially the American dream. And they're what's being depicted on the arrival of television on its shows. And so you see the quote from the book here says, a cult of domesticity emerged in popular culture to celebrate those eternal feminine functions. When 1950s television programs like Ozzie and Harriet or Leave It to Beaver depicted idyllic suburban families with a working husband, 2 children, and a wife who did not work outside the home, they did so without irony, because this is essentially what America was becoming. We were becoming this American dream, if you will, okay? The next thing we're going to see here, it says of some 40 million new jobs created in the 3 decades after 1950, more than 30 million were in clerical and service work. Women filled the huge Women filled the huge majority of these new positions and created an extensive pink-collar ghetto. All right, so now we've talked about white-collar and blue-collar, and now we're starting to see the rise of the pink-collar, all right? Areas of work where women were already well accepted into things like clerical and service work, all right? And then to get more into the culture here, we have Diners Club introduced the plastic credit card in 1949, just 1 year after the first McDonald's hamburger stand opened in San Bernardino, California. In 1955, Disneyland opened its doors in Anaheim, California. Okay, so what's happening here? Well, we're seeing All three of these things starting to work in conjunction. Okay, obviously it's going to take a while for that credit card to really take hold, but we are going to see that the concept itself is going to absolutely be pervasive in all of American culture from that point forward. Now, not only are we buying things on credit, we're buying things on credit cards, meaning we don't have to go through a process of getting a loan and everything like that. We're already pre-approved up to a certain amount, and we can go ahead and spend that money. All right, credit cards are going to change the way we do life. And then we have McDonald's. Nobody originally, when it came to McDonald's, especially when you see this first hamburger stand, nobody understood the concept. But if you were to get and do a little bit of research, or even watch the Netflix movie The Founder, you would see some really crazy things about the way McDonald's kind of got its beginning. And the guys who originated the McDonald's hamburgers, they legit put this thing into a streamlined process to where they're legitimately assembly line on cheeseburgers. Okay, and instead of car hops being the thing, which were very much the thing in the 1950s, car hops, the being in those little burger joints, it sometimes took a lot of time. And here, what they're doing is you pull up to a parking lot and you walk up to a window, and you've got your meal in X amount of seconds flat. And this was the beginning, really, of fast food, okay? No more are you waiting, 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes on your meal. You go up there and you're going to have your meal in your hands in less than a minute. Like, it was absolutely streamlined. It was kind of awesome. And then again, what are we seeing? We're seeing Disneyland open. Disneyland, this means we're going to be very much based on a consumerist culture and on a vacation culture, okay? Because again, our cars are getting faster and better, and now we're driving all over the country and taking our families with us because we now have vacation time in these jobs that are being provided, all right? What else? TV sets were rich people's novelties in the 1940s, but 7 million sets were sold in 1951. And by 1960, virtually every American home had one. Okay, so between 1950 and 1960, we're seeing that television sets is something that everybody owns, and everybody is into watching the same type of culture, right? What's coming across on those TV sets, and it's kind of an amazing situation. I better turn my ringer off before that keeps bothering me. What else? In music, okay, you see the man on the screen here. This is Elvis Presley. The quote on the bottom part of the screen over here is from the textbook. It says, Elvis Presley fused black rhythm and blues with white bluegrass and country and created a new musical idiom forever known as rock and roll. Rock was crossover music, carrying its heavy beat and driving rhythms across the cultural divide that separated black and white musical traditions. Okay, so what really does Elvis Presley contribute? Okay, well, we refer to him as the king of rock and roll, but what in the world is rock and roll? In previous generations, we had kind of come, especially in like the 1920s and 30s, we'd come to where we really, even white culture in the United States, white culture loved black jazz and blues, right? And so it was kind of a music form that everybody could really enjoy, okay? Well, Elvis Presley's going to do the same thing, only he's going to do this with rock and roll to where people of every background can kind of like rock and roll. Now, obviously, there's some older people who were absolutely just dumbfounded by the ardent amount of sexuality that comes into this. And really what they're talking about is the way that Elvis Presley moves when he sings, okay? If you see the quote up there from Elvis Presley, he says, please, Mr. Scholes, don't make me stand still. If I can't move, I can't sing, all right? And it was his gyrating hips is what the older ladies would refer to it as, and they felt like he was oversexing America, and these young ladies were growing up lusty and things like that. Well, along those same lines, men had their own sex symbols, as you see here on the screen now is Marilyn Monroe, and you see the first real wardrobe malfunction when she walks over the steam grate and her dress blows up and the camera's there and she's there to pose perfectly and everything like that. But Marilyn Monroe was absolutely a gorgeous girl, and she was a movie star and she was a whole lot of things. But then there had always been kind of smut magazines and stuff like that that have naked women in them and things like that. But Playboy magazine is going to bring this into the main part of culture. They have articles in Playboy magazine. They talk about things in Playboy magazine, and it's supposed to be that Playboy magazine is actually a tasteful thing in many more circles than previous attempts at the same thing had done. And Marilyn Monroe, the great sex symbol of America, is going to pose in this thing. Like, who would have imagined somebody from mainstream culture being in one of those magazines? But again, American culture is changing. The quote for the book says, many critics lamented the implications of this new consumerist lifestyle. Harvard economist John Kenneth Galbraith questioned the relation between private wealth and public good in a series of books beginning with The Affluent Society. The post-war explosion of prosperity had produced a troublesome combination of private opulence amid public squalor. And I love the analysis here. He says, Americans had televisions in their homes, but garbage in their streets. They ate rich food, but breathed foul air. But Galbraith's call for social spending to match private purchasing fell on mostly deaf ears in the giddily affluent 1950s. All right. What else? Politically, the outcome of the presidential election of 1952 was never really in doubt. Given an extra prod by Eisenhower's last-minute pledge to go personally to Korea to end the war, the voters overwhelmingly declared for Ike. 7 long months later, after Eisenhower hinted that he might use atomic weapons, an armistice was finally signed. And so they're going to bring an end, or at least an armistice, to the Korean War. Technically speaking, the Korean War, I know this is going to sound crazy, but the Korean War just ended last year officially. They had an armistice, which means they agreed to stop fighting. They agreed to put down their weapons, but they were going to keep that DMZ alive and well there in Korea, and they would just stand across from it for all these other generations, right? But at least the fighting is over by the time you get to Ike promising that he would go to Korea and then kind of whispering that he might be using some atomic weapons, and suddenly the Koreans were interested in peace, right? So let's get to our black box here. It says Eisenhower's greatest asset as president was his, and the answer you're looking for here is his enjoyment of the affection and respect of the American people. Okay, like you see here in the picture, he was America's grandpa, and you couldn't help but like America's grandpa, right? What else is happening politically? Well, as we mentioned in class the other day in chapter 36, McCarthyism. Senator Joseph McCarthy, the black box here. Among anti-communists, Senator Joseph McCarthy was and the answer you're looking for is the one who most damaged free speech and fair play. Okay. As you see the political cartoon here, he says, I have here in my hand, and then we see a doctored photo and a fake letter. He used a bunch of made up stuff to ruin a whole lot of people's lives and careers. Okay. And that's really the black eye that we get from the age of McCarthy. And then the second thing we see there in the black box says Senator McCarthy first rose to national prominence by charging that dozens of known communists were working within the United States State Department. Okay. Now, what is the overall effect of the McCarthy crusade against communist subversion? Okay. If you look at the quote down there in the bottom left, it says, and this from your textbook as well, it says McCarthyite purges deprived the government of a number of Asian specialists who might have counseled a wiser course in Vietnam in the fateful decade that, I don't know, another word there, okay? So what are we seeing here? The black box. As a result of Senator McCarthy's crusade against communist subversion in America, the answer you're looking for here is that the State Department lost a number of Asian specialists who might have counseled a wiser course in Vietnam. Okay, just because they're communists and working for the State Department doesn't mean they're trying to turn the State Department into communists. Okay, doesn't mean they're trying to turn the country into a communist country. And his purges of communists actually got rid of people who could have given us better advice when it came to what to do about what was happening in Vietnam. Because the big question is Russian communism the same thing as Chinese communism, the same thing as Korean communism, the same thing as Eastern European and Cuban, and then eventually Vietnamese communism? The answer is no. Each of these are kind of their own thing. While some of the principles might be essentially the same, we're talking in Vietnam about extremely poor people, not highly politically motivated people who were going to, be dangerous to America and everything like that. All right. And then we get to what's happening here socially with relations and the civil rights movement. All right. Black box. The 1954 decision, Brown v. Board of Education, Topeka, the Supreme Court did what? They declared that the concept of separate but equal facilities for blacks and whites was unconstitutional. Okay. So just as we had Plessy v. Ferguson back in 1896, we now have a 1954 decision, Brown v. Board of Education. The separate but equal standard that was set by Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 is overturned by Brown v. Board of Education. All right. And essentially what we're seeing here is we're trying to get rid of segregation, especially when it comes to public schools, because that's the real topic in the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision. Okay. So does that mean that because the Supreme Court has made the decision that suddenly everything's fixed? Well, textbook tells us 10 years after the court's momentous ruling, fewer than 2% of the eligible blacks in the Deep South were sitting in classrooms with whites. Okay. Even though the Supreme Court had ruled against segregation, it was going to continue because you still had to have somebody actually enforce that decision. And there were not a whole lot of people really heading that direction. And so there is going to be a full-on rise in the civil rights movement. Okay. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, okay, otherwise known as SNCC, okay. What's going to happen here is that they're going to start a movement called the sit-in movement, and they're going to start to try to desegregate various parts of their culture, starting with a Woolworth's lunch counter. Okay, if you know the way the civil rights movement was kind of working here, these little restaurants and stuff like that, if you were black, you had to go kind of to the back window, get your stuff to go, and go on your way. You couldn't actually go in and sit down and eat in a restaurant. Okay. You see 4 college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, stayed in their seats at a Woolworth's lunch counter after being refused service because of their race. And what happens over the next few days is that protesters are going to fill 63 of the 66 seats at the lunch counter, and they would show up every day, every day. They would show up, they were dedicated, well-behaved, and they ended each of these sit-ins with a prayer, okay? And eventually, these sit-ins are going to have, they're going to take place in about 50 southern U.S. cities, okay? We even had our own in Oklahoma City with Clara Looper. That'd be a good one to Google. But these sit-ins, they're forcing the issue. And they're basically going to shut down these restaurants because nobody else can go in there and sit. And they're going to do it just by going in there and refusing to get up. And the second somebody else gets up, that's going to be filled up with another black person, another black person, another black person, until these places go out of business or change their policy. The black box. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was an outgrowth of and the answer you're looking for is the sit-in movement launched by young Southern blacks. All right. Your quote from the textbook here says, talking about Eisenhower, says, true to his small government philosophy, Eisenhower supported the transfer of control over offshore oil fields from the federal government to the states. He also tried to curb the TVA by encouraging a private power company to build a generating plant to compete with the massive public utility spawned by the New Deal. All right. However, there are other Eisenhower policies that are a little bit less good, especially for local purposes, if you know what I'm getting at here. Okay. When it comes to Native Americans, the quote you see there says he proposed to terminate the tribes as legal entities and to revert to the assimilationist goals of the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887. All right. So your black box answer, Eisenhower's policies toward Native Americans included a return to the assimilationist goals of the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887. Okay. What else was Eisenhower doing? He's also going to end up promoting and then building the interstate highway. Okay. What happened here with the interstate highway? Well, this is the 1950s, and we have a lot of atomic anxiety here. And so what he was actually going to use here was a pretty good excuse to say that in the event of nuclear war, we need the people in our cities to be able to escape those cities really, really, really quickly. And our highway system doesn't currently allow that. And so he's going to build this thing very much built on the model of the German Autobahn. And the interstate highway was actually built as escape routes from cities, but obviously is going to spread all over the entire United States. Your black box here says the Eisenhower promoted public works project that was far larger and more expensive than anything in Roosevelt's New Deal was the interstate highway system. All right. And so here we go. What's happening in foreign policy? Well, one of the biggest sore spots we have in the country is what's taking place in Vietnam. All right. And we see the black box here says the leader of the nationalist movement in Vietnam since the end of World War I was Ho Chi Minh. And this was the very Vietnamese little chef that was there at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 that was trying to get Woodrow Wilson's attention because Woodrow Wilson was proclaiming a bunch of principles that he supposedly believed in. And Ho Chi Minh, whose name was Dien Thap Thanh at that point, was begging him to give the same thing to the Vietnamese people, to end French rule of Vietnam. And Mr. Wilson refused to listen to that because France was supposed to be our ally. And even though that's the things he's supposed to believe in, he's not going to jeopardize that alliance with France, right? And so Ho Chi Minh is going to bring communism to Vietnam, and there's going to be a nationalist Vietnamese movement toward that direction. All right. Now, by 1954, American taxpayers were financing nearly 80% of the costs of a bottomless French colonial war in Indochina. All right. So originally, this was not us fighting in Vietnam. This was the French fighting in Vietnam until Dien Bien Phu. And what's going to happen here is that the French are going to lose to the Vietnamese and lose quite miserably. And it's at this point that we're going to get a little bit more involved and a little bit more involved. And it stops being us paying for the war and it starts being us paying for and fighting the war. And so that will continue to be a sore spot. And then in other places in the world, we have a hot spot in Iran. The quote from the book here says, the government of Iran, supposedly influenced by the Kremlin, which is a reference to the Soviet Union, began to resist the power of the gigantic Western companies that controlled Iranian petroleum. In response, the American CIA helped to engineer a coup in 1953 that installed the youthful Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. All right? Literally, our CIA in these wildcat days engineered a coup. Okay? We overturned governments. That's what our CIA is doing. Again, there's a lot of things to be concerned about when it comes to those early days of the CIA. And then we have the Eisenhower Doctrine. In 1957, Eisenhower Doctrine empowered the president to extend economic and military aid to nations of, and the answer is the Middle East, that wanted to help to resist communist aggression. So just like we had a Truman Doctrine that's offering to extend economic and military aid to Turkey and Greece, the Eisenhower Doctrine is going to do the same thing essentially for countries of the Middle East. All right. By the time we get to 1956, all right, you see the quote from the textbook here. It says, in fragile health, Eisenhower began his second term as a part-time president. Critics charged that he kept his hands on his golf clubs, fly rod, and shotgun more often than on the levers of power. And that's actually kind of a true statement. He did a lot more relaxing and enjoying life during that second term than he did anything else. But essentially at this point, there were a lot of things that really didn't need presidential control either. With other parts of this Cold War fever that's going on, we see here the quote from the book says, rocket fever swept the nation. Eisenhower established the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, otherwise known as NASA, and directed billions of dollars to missile development. The success of Sputnik led to a critical comparison of the American educational system, which was already under fire as too easygoing, with that of the Soviet Union. And what we're talking about here is that the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, and then they launched Sputnik 2. And essentially what these are little satellites that they were able to get into space. Okay, and the fact that they did that before us, it gave us rise to great concern. Okay, we're going to establish NASA, and we're going to establish the National Defense and Education Act, which is going to be something that's going to very much shape education and fund education and require standards in education so that we're not falling behind the Soviet Union. All right. The Paris Summit Conference scheduled for 1960 collapsed because of what? Collapsed because of what was called the U-2 incident, the U-2 spy plane incident. All right. And essentially what happened here is we had offered an open skies treaty and everything like that with the Russians, and they summarily rejected that. And what we were saying is, you can spy on us from the air, we'll spy on you from the air, and that way, we don't have to be suspicious and worry about what each other has if we can see it from the air, and it'll bring, a little bit of a calm to the Cold War. The Russians rejected that. Quite honestly, they didn't need spy planes because they had spies on the ground all over our country. So, what's the point of the spy planes, right? But that's absolutely going to affect the Cold War quite dramatically. In other places, like, Cuba, you see the quote here says, iron-fisted dictator Fulgencio Batista, in power since the 1930s, had encouraged huge investments of American capital, and Washington, in turn, had given him some support. But early in 1959, black-bearded Fidel Castro engineered a revolution that ousted Batista, an exodus of anti-Castro Cubans headed for the United States, especially for Florida. Nearly 1 million arrived between 1960 and 2000. Washington broke diplomatic relations with Castro's government early in 1961 and imposed a strict embargo on trade with Cuba. Strengthened by the Helms-Burton Act 1996, the Castro regime has remained in power ever since. All right. So we see that Cuba is now becoming a hot spot as they've turned into a communist country as well. All right. Last black box, I think. No, we got a couple more. It says, when Dwight Eisenhower left the presidency in 1961, the answer is he remained an extraordinarily popular figure. Everybody genuinely did like Ike, and he's one of the few presidents in all of American history that was more popular when he left office than even when he took office. Most presidents, they wane in popularity dramatically between the time they take office and by the time they leave office. All right. The factor that may well have tipped the electoral scales for JFK, who's going to run as a Democrat. Okay, Eisenhower was a Republican. JFK is running as a Democrat. But the thing that tipped this electoral scales in JFK's favor in the election of 1960 was actually the first ever presidentially televised debate. All right. And you see the quote here. It says, television may well have tipped the scales. The debates once again demonstrated the importance of image over substance in the television age. Many viewers found Kennedy's glamour and vitality far more appealing than Nixon's tired and pallid appearance. And essentially what happened here in this televised debate is that JFK took advantage of what it meant to be on TV. They came up, they gave him the makeup that he needed to show up well, to look good on these things. He had been spending the previous week enjoying life, sailing in New Hampshire. He was tanned and looking good. He was well rested. Nixon had been working his butt off on the campaign trail. He was tired. He was worn out by the time he showed up here for this debate. He looked pale. He looked bad, and refused the makeup that would have made him look better. And essentially, the crazy thing here in this particular debate is half of the Americans watched the debate on TV. The other half of Americans listened to the debate on radio. And those that listened to it on radio believe that Nixon had won the debate because he seemed to know more about what he's talking about. Well, he should. He'd been in politics for a really long time. JFK was kind of a newcomer. But those that watched it on television felt like JFK won. Why? Because he looked better saying it. Because again, image over substance became a thing in the United States at this point. I think that's all I have for you now. So take this Ed puzzle and finish that thing, and we'll be done with chapter 37.